Thank you for joining us for our second IRP CoLab launch webinar. IRP CoLab is a multi-stakeholder collaborative initiative designed to support the power sector as it adapts to new challenges through consistent, transparent, and forward-looking planning practices. We bring together a variety of stakeholders, including software developers, modelers, researchers, and utilities in this endeavor. If we can just go to the next slide, please. On April 23rd, we launched IRP CoLab with the panel discussion and presentation on the best practices rubric. I think some of you were able to attend that session. That work was meant to provide a curated synthesis of well-established practices. In contrast, the work that we are presenting today, the Emerging Themes series, delves into themes that are still considered evolving, but are important for good resource planning. We have 3 topics, which are listed on the slide. And after each presentation, we'll take clarifying questions. And at the end, we'll have a moderated panel discussion. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, which you can access at the bottom of the Zoom window. So we'll begin with a presentation on modeling for coordinated resource and transmission planning. If we can go to the next slide, please. This will be presented by Nick Oberski and Aaron Schwartz, both who are with Telos Energy. Aaron is a senior engineer, and Nick is a principal power systems engineer. And Nick and Aaron, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Priya. I appreciate that. Thank you, everybody, just for taking the time to attend today. Appreciate you listening to our overview of the coordinated resource and transmission planning environment here. Cass, if you go to the next slide. So typically, transmission planning and resource planning have operated in their own silos, doing their own analysis, making their own assumptions, and getting to the results that they individually need. Part of our deep dive is to present a 3-part framework that would help with crossing that divide between these two planning environments to help encourage results from one another to be shared and also just really seek out the lowest cost solution for the entire system. So if we go to the next slide, we've got a Venn diagram that kind of puts together all the different types of analysis that each of the planning environments do. So on the transmission planning side, they're going to be focused on identifying network reinforcements of those in the form of upgrades or rebuilds, and ultimately determining what investments need to be made in the transmission network. On the generation planning side, they're going to be looking at what does the generation portfolio look like out in the future? What additions do we need? What retirements are coming up? And those can come in different forms: thermal, renewable, storage, and so on. And so there's also some overlap in some of the information that's needed in these 2 types of analyses. And so in the middle there, one that I'm going to point out is load growth. So each of these planning environments are going to consider a load growth profile as they look out into the future. And so that's one place that we see an opportunity to kind of coordinate those assumptions around what load we're expecting to come on as we look at these 2 different analyses. So on the next slide, I want to highlight what is the importance of integrating these 2 types of planning environments. And so I'll give some simple examples. So if we think about on the generation side, if we run our analysis and identify locations where we can locate what looks to be a low-cost generation solution, if we're not considering the transmission network capabilities within that area, we may end up where, yes, the generation's low cost, but installing that resource in those locations results in significant transmission network upgrades to allow that load to help serve, or that generation to help serve the load that it's looking to do. And so if we kind of blind to that, we may miss that on the generation side. And then also in transmission, if we are not thinking about where new resources may come online, we may miss an easy opportunity to do simple upgrades that would unlock the ability to connect high quality, low cost renewable generation. So if we're not considering each other's outcomes, we maybe missed opportunities specifically on the cost side that we're not having in resulting in an ultimate low cost system. Next slide here, Cassie. So just a high level, Aaron will touch on specific examples and where some of this is happening, but this is our three-part framework. Starting on the left, we have incorporate, and then we have iterate, and then finally co-optimize. And you could think of these as stair steps, with each of them being a little bit more difficult, but also helping result in a better developed system. So if we start with incorporate, that's just simply sharing data and assumptions between the two environments. So sharing the same assumptions like load growth or sharing the results of the outcomes of the individual studies across that divide. We would say that this is the first step of this framework, and we are not seeing all utilities implementing this today. The next one is iterate. This takes it a little bit further in that you run your analysis, you then share those results with the other side where they can then run their analysis and then provide feedback. So you can think of it as a loop where we're able to iterate back and forth between the two environments. And the advantage of this one is that allows us to validate and then adjust further the analysis that we're doing. We see this one as the best practice for today. And then the last one is co-optimized. So this is where we have simultaneously integrated the generation and transmission planning together to help seek that true low cost for the system-wide solution. So we would say this is the goal, the kind of gold star that you would want to look for. And there are companies that are doing parts of this, but really nobody's doing this fully today due to just a few reasons. At this point, I'll turn over to Aaron, who can talk through some of the examples of these.
Great, thank you, Nick. So we're going to be working through this framework, starting with incorporate. Incorporate is kind of has two sides, incorporating from transmission planning models and tools to generation planning, and vice versa. So let's start on the left box here of information. So this could be data, assumptions, and outputs and results that we might be able to move from transmission planning, incorporating those into generation planning. So the first option here is to move away from copper sheet models by defining transmission zones and zonal transfer limits. So a common practice in capacity expansion modeling today that underpins the identification and generation of portfolios within generation planning is to essentially abstract away the transmission network and network topology, assuming that all generators, all loads just form a single copper sheet network without those network constraints. But one opportunity is to integrate some of that network resolution into these models by defining zones and transfer limits between those zones. And some of the common transmission planning studies can be used in order to help identify what those zonal boundaries are and the transfer limits between them. And this can help provide higher resolution, more accurate representations of the network as we think about and make generation planning decisions through these tools. Another option is to incorporate transmission cost adders to resource portfolios. Commonly in generation planning, we have associated capital and investment costs for different types of resources, but these can miss the costs associated with actually interconnecting them to the system, or adding needed network reinforcements. So by incorporating those costs, we can more accurately balance what the system-wide costs are for adding new resources, and better optimize the resulting portfolio. Finally, on the side is to capture capacity contributions of transmission. So being able to incorporate some of the expected value that transmission could provide during tight margin conditions, resource adequacy, shortfall events, and being able to incorporate that value, whether that's through adjustments in reserve margin requirements or even accreditation, or like ELCC for transmission, can bring that within the generation planning tools. Moving in the other direction, so incorporating information from generation to transmission planning models. Option number one here is to incorporate realistic resource additions and generator dispatch into transmission planning snapshot cases. So Typically, transmission planners will look at a summer peak, winter peak, and a low load scenario or shoulder season. Um, and being able to configure these snapshots with a realistic representation of what future resources might be that can come from, for example, a capacity expansion model informed future portfolio can help make these snapshots more realistic by representing that generation mix. In addition, bullet number 2 is evaluating additional representative snapshot cases to evaluate critical system conditions. So as the resource mix changes, for example, with a greater reliance on storage and renewables, the typical periods in which system risk was greatest can be shifting. And so being able to look at, for example, resource adequacy analysis, commonly done in generation planning, to specifically identify what those tight margin conditions are, and then be able to develop and incorporate additional snapshot cases that look beyond just those traditional summer and winter peak load periods can help give us a more nuanced understanding of when system stress periods are and then how the transmission network will perform during them. Next slide, please. So these two examples are really one-way processes, incorporating information from one process to the other. What we show here is just one example of a more iterative process, where not only are we moving information from transmission planning to generation planning models, but then iterating back and taking the result of the outputs from the generation planning model to then reassess some of our transmission planning assumptions. So this example here is specifically for siting to relieve network reliability violations. I think Nick mentioned in one of the earlier slides is how in some cases, adding new generation can then trigger network reliability violations that we might miss without a more integrated process. The opposite can be true too, with deliberate and intentional siting of generation resources can mitigate certain network reliability challenges. So I'm not going to walk through this whole figure, but at a high level, what we're doing is we start by running a transmission and planning model, so an AC power flow modeling that will identify reliability violations, line overloads, failing to meet certain voltage or stability criteria, and then being able to incorporate where those challenging locations are on the network into the capacity expansion model. This might be giving cost adders to incentivize citing certain resources in zones where these challenges are showing up, and providing that additional information. Say, hey, if we build certain generation in certain locations, we can help mitigate some of these violations. This could then inform a optimized resource portfolio that considers the transmission network. We can pass back that portfolio to the transmission planning model and then take another look. Are these violations now mitigated? Are there new violations perhaps resulting from this portfolio? And we can continue to iterate accordingly. Ultimately, in the center here, this allows us to perform nodal or zonal assignments of specific generation resources that reflect their ability to support network reliability. Next slide. So as Nick mentioned, this is kind of what we see as today's best practice. And we see examples from both within IRPs and from other utility leaders in really showing examples. So one is from HECO, Hawaiian Electric, who in their integrated grid plan took results from their steady state and dynamic stability analyses to inform specific adjustments to their expansion plans. And specifically making modifications to the renewable energy zones to avoid conductor overloads. EPRI also performed a NISO case study in which they identified specific transmission lines that were congested in production cost modeling, and then were able to make adjustments in their capacity expansion model, rerunning that model to select economic upgrades to mitigate those congested lines. And then finally, Pacific Core's 2025 IRP included, again, iteration between capacity expansion and more detailed production cost modeling to identify economic benefits that weren't captured within the lower resolution capacity expansion models, making these granularity adjustments to reflect these network benefits. Next slide. So I want to touch just briefly on this final sort of gold star aspirational approach, which is co-optimized modeling. In co-optimized framework, we are using tools to identify solutions that meet generation and transmission needs simultaneously, really identifying system-wide least cost portfolios. However, there are several challenges that make this difficult. This requires very high resolution models. They require detailed data integration between tools. And so today, a fully co-optimized approach is largely infeasible, though there are advances being made in decomposition techniques, for example, tools that more harmoniously integrate transmission and generation planning. But I think there's still work to be done to really make these co-optimized approaches more scalable and available to planners. That said, we are seeing more limited examples or narrower examples of where co-optimization is happening. And one of these approaches is specifically allowing capacity expansion models to see network upgrades or transmission expansion as a economic selectable resource that can be chosen alongside new generation or storage. In this way, these tools can co-optimize investments more at a system level, selecting transmission and generation solutions together. And examples of this we are seeing, for example, in PacifiCorp's IRP, as I mentioned on the previous slide, as well as regional planning efforts, for example, through West Tech. Next slide, and over to you, Chris, to close us out. Nick, excuse me.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Appreciate it. Yeah, so on this last slide here, so what can we do as utilities, as regulators, or tool developers to kind of work towards these different frameworks that we talked about? So first one, I kind of mentioned at the top that each of the planning environments have their own language, assumptions, and tools that they use. So the first thing we do is just to be able to understand better what each of the environments are doing and what are the results that they're looking for so that you can better understand what they're doing on their side and how information that you have could help them. So being able to foster that cross-disciplinary understanding. Next, it's looking at developing ways of robust data sharing pipelines, including any improvements to tool interoperability. And so some of these could be internal tools, some of them may be actually software improvements to the software that's being used for this analysis. The third one, as Aaron kind of mentioned, standard high resolution models. So getting away from that copper sheet example that he shared. The fourth one is really about broadening your view when you're looking at your analysis that you're doing. So evaluating non-wire and non-generation alternatives in the process. So on the transmission planning side, be thinking about not only network upgrades that you've traditionally done in terms of new lines, line upgrades, and so on, but also considering how generation may play a part in that solution. And then vice versa. On the generation planning side, may want to consider how additional transmission network upgrades may unlock ability to deliver low-cost energy to the grid. And then finally, this is not just a technical problem, although there are barriers there that I think we can overcome. There's also policies that need to be implemented that don't inadvertently constrain movement forward in this path. And so an example of that may be a policy that's written that requires a very specific tool be used for a type of analysis. And that tool may not have great interoperability or may not have well output data that could be used elsewhere. So making sure our policies are set up such that they allow some openness to selecting tools that help serve each of the planning environments best and ultimately the system as well. So with that, I think Priya, I'll kick it back to you.
Great. Thanks so much. That was excellent. Just checking in the Q&A box as a reminder, if you have questions, you can post them there. Not seeing any clarifying questions, we'll move on to our next presentation on integrated resource planning for an uncertain future, which I know is a topic a lot of folks are thinking about, especially now with large load growth. We have Gabe Montaigne, who is the CEO and co-founder of resilient transition that will walk us through his deep dive paper. Take it away, Gabe.
Great. Thank you very much, Priya, for the introduction. So I'm going to keep my presentation relatively concise and quick here, and I'm definitely super happy to have an in-depth discussion, kind of both at the end of my allotted time here, and then also at the top of the hour we have our joint discussion. So yeah, this is definitely a topic I'm happy to chat about and answer any questions. So just to go ahead and jump right in. So I think a big part of the motivation for why this topic of kind of planning under uncertainty is more important now than ever is I think if we look back at the last 50 to 100 years of grid planning, there was basically a pretty narrow set of futures or like ranges of possible futures for kind of key variables like load growth and generation availability that the grid could take. So grid planners were planning for fairly predictable load growth, and they had a fairly narrow set of generation types. And planning for a reliable grid basically looked like just kind of figuring out how much capacity of thermal generation to build to meet peak load, right? But now we're in this world where the uncertainties that grid planners have to manage are what we call deep. So we basically have no idea what demand is going to be 10 years from now. It's very hard to predict what resource costs will look like 5 to 10 years from now. And it's even very hard to figure out how much of different resources will be available to build. Like we don't know if there's going to be siting opposition to solar farms or wind farms. We don't know what law Congress is going to pass in 5 years, right? So basically what this means is that it's much harder to make decisions confidently, especially when you have long lead time investments like transmission lines that can take over 10 years to build, right? So it's a time where demand is growing really fast. And there's a lot of new investments that we want to make to keep the grid reliable and affordable and resilient. But the future of the grid is very uncertain. So we don't know necessarily how these assets that we might want to invest in are going to perform. If you can go to the next slide, please. So what I have here is an example of why kind of more traditional grid planning processes break down. So what we have here is a map of California, and I would ask everyone to consider 2 hypothetical resource investment sites or places where resources could be built. And imagine that you are a transmission planner trying to figure out which transmission upgrades to pursue to meet these future resource builds. So at the top left here, we have a potential solar project area in orange. And at the top right here in the blue, we have a potential wind project area. So what you can imagine doing is you can imagine that there's 3 potential transmission upgrade options to connect these resources. One is basically directly connecting the solar resource to load. That's this line in orange here. Another is directly connecting this wind project area to load. That's the one in blue. And then the third one is this one in purple, which is basically a more flexible line that can be useful regardless of which resource actually is available and shows up. And so the key point here is that if you're using traditional planning processes where you basically just look at the future, pretend that you know what's going to happen in 10 years from now, put all of your cost assumptions in, and what that planning process is going to tell you is it's just going to tell you what to do based on assuming that you know the future with perfect certainty, right? So if you put this into a capacity expansion model and say the capacity expansion model predicted that the solar project would get built, then your capacity expansion model would also decide to build that orange transmission line there. But in reality, what the situation that you're actually in is that you don't actually know which of these resources is going to be built. So it actually makes a lot more sense to invest in this flexible and robust and adaptable transmission line that can be useful regardless of which resource actually shows up. And so the key point here is that if you're just planning what we call deterministically, which means that you only use one set of kind of perfect foresight inputs, then you're going to miss these more flexible and adaptable transmission options, right? And also, even if you just model two different deterministic scenarios individually and kind of compare them, like say I was modeling a scenario for where solar is available, and then a different one for where wind is available, you still might miss those kind of more robust and flexible transmission upgrades that kind of don't show up in just one deterministic scenario. So the key point here, that's a lot of words, is basically that it's really important that we think about these kind of flexible and robust and adaptable transmission upgrades that are going to be useful no matter what the future turns out to be. But the planning processes that we use now tend to miss these types of upgrades. And what this means is that we're basically over optimized for one particular feature. If you can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so this is one of our key graphics from the report. And what I'm showing on the left is what traditional planning processes look like now. And this is called deterministic optimization. So as I was saying before, basically what planners tend to do now is they will make a set of scenarios for how the future could play out. These could be different scenarios for load growth or resource cost or resource availability. It could be anything. And then what planners tend to do is they just kind of compare all of these different scenarios, and they often just take one of them as like the main one or like the reference or the baseline. And so a really key part here is that when you're doing this, this is assuming that A, you know the future with perfect certainty, and B, it's assuming that all the decisions that ever have to be made now. But in reality, what we want to emphasize and kind of move towards people understanding is that in reality, there are a set of decisions that you need to make now. That's what we call the here and now decisions in orange here. And then there's a set of decisions that actually you can make later. And those are these things in blue here. And we call those the wait and see decisions. So in reality, there's decisions you make now and decisions that you can actually wait to make later. And basically just kind of breaking it up into this opens the door to really considering those kinds of more flexible and adaptable investments where you might be able to do one thing now and then do a different thing later. So those are the kind of key things that are wrong with deterministic optimization. And so one of the most basic things that planners can do to kind of take steps towards addressing this is to actually use scenarios in a much more intelligent way. And this is what we call scenario analysis. And I realize that this is kind of a confusing terminology because we're also talking about scenarios in the context of deterministic optimization. But the reason we use this is that this concept of scenario analysis has actually been around for a very long time. And the key point here is that when you're considering different scenarios, you're using those scenarios to basically think about different ways that the future could evolve, not different scenarios for like different investment options that you can make. So basically the key idea behind scenario analysis is that you want to first consider all of the different possible decisions that you could make in the near term, and then come up with a set of scenarios for how the future could evolve, and then basically stress test your different decisions against all of those different scenarios. What this ends up looking like is like instead of just a set of a few different scenarios, it looks like a matrix, right? So you have all of the different possible decisions, and then you have all of the different ways that the future could evolve. And what you can imagine this resulting in is that if you can kind of accurately capture the range of possible decisions that are available to you in the near term, this process can help you figure out which of those decisions are going to do best amongst the range of possible ways that the future could evolve, right? So I think one kind of intuitive kind of big picture example before I jump into a grid specific example is that you can imagine if I'm trying to decide like whether or not to buy car insurance, right? If I knew the future with perfect certainty, I would never buy car insurance, right? But if I consider the fact that actually I can choose to buy car insurance or not buy car insurance in theory, and then I know that there's actually a range of different ways that the future could evolve because I don't know what's going to happen, I would see that buying car insurance is a much better move, right? Because I don't actually know what's going to happen in the future. I don't know when I'm going to get into an accident, right? So it's kind of what the key point here is that it's really important to move from a framework of just thinking deterministically to thinking more in terms of this idea of there's a set of decisions that you have to make now, and then the future is uncertain and we don't know how they're going to evolve. But then also there's a set of decisions in the future that we could make to adapt, right? And so when you move to this kind of a framework, then this is when you start to see decisions like the flexible transmission line investment I mentioned in the previous slide become optimal. If you could go to the next slide, please. So what I'm showing here is an example from the integrated resource plan of Portland General Electric. So what they did is basically exactly what I'm talking about here. They developed a very wide set of kind of candidate portfolio decisions, and those are all of the different rows here. I think they came up with over 30, maybe 40. And what they did is they basically stress tested all of these different portfolio decisions amongst the range of different ways that the future could evolve. So they came up with, I think it was like 8 different possible futures. And then there's 2 of them that I'm showing here, which are this like GHG constrained future, which is a future in which the Oregon legislature patches more greenhouse gas legislation. And then another one of the futures that they examine is a future where technology costs increase a lot in the future. And so what they did is kind of a first pass in their portfolio development is they tested all of their different portfolios. And once again, these are the rows. They tested them amongst all of these different possible ways that the future could evolve. And what they did as a first pass is they basically took the futures in which their different decisions actually looked really bad, and they decided to basically exclude those ones from consideration. And that's what's happening at the bottom here, right? This exclude versus include. You can see that there are different things that get excluded by different cases. And what that's finding is basically like plausible ways that the future could evolve in which decisions you could make now could perform badly, right? So you can see that, for example, here, this 250 megawatt in 2025, which is like the 5th from the bottom on the left here, that does not do well in a GHG constrained cost future, but it does do okay in a high tech cost future. So what they did is they said, okay, we think that this GHG constrained future is something that we want to consider, and we're going to exclude that one from consideration. Can you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so that's kind of the general idea, right? It's the most important thing to take away here is that it's really important to think about scenarios in terms of stress testing decisions that you might make now. And so the key thing here, though, is that in the context of grid planning, oftentimes it's not so difficult, or it's not so easy to come up with a satisfactorily wide range of all of those possible candidate decisions, especially when you start to move towards considering generation and transmission at the same time. You can often end up with like hundreds of thousands of combinations of different investments, right? So if you're really trying to co-optimize generation and transmission, or even if you just have hundreds of different generation investment options, it can be helpful to actually think a little bit more carefully about how you generate portfolio decisions in the near term that actually do well when the future is uncertain. So the second thing that we cover in the paper is basically how you can go about generating robust portfolios that do well in an uncertain future. So the baseline sort of way of doing this is, of course, deterministic optimization, where you just optimize for one future scenario at a time. The second thing, which is actually very widely used in transmission planning, is this idea of kind of heuristically taking information from different deterministic scenarios to come up with things that do well across the multiple possible futures. So what you can imagine doing is if you were, so to go back to the California transmission example, if you can imagine if you were to just consider those 3 transmission investment options, right? This kind of approach would potentially help you find that kind of flexible option, right? Because you could see that flexible transmission upgrade option would actually do well and show up in those multiple different scenarios. The third option, which is kind of more explicitly designed at, or it's more explicitly targeted to finding portfolios that are flexible and adaptable, is stochastic optimization. And basically what's going on here is that you are taking multiple different possible scenarios for how the future could evolve and actually integrating them into an optimization model to help find those more flexible and robust and adaptable transmission options. So what this does is it's telling the optimization model that the future is uncertain, and it's asking it to basically come up with those robust options. And the last option is robust optimization. which instead of taking different future scenarios, what it does is it's actually taking basically different ranges for how the future could evolve. So maybe you have a range of load growth or a range of resource costs. And it's kind of taking all of those ranges to figure out a near-term portfolio that does best in the worst case for how things could evolve. And a key point here is that you're not just kind of a priori deciding what the worst case is going to be. The optimization itself is deciding it's helping to find a portfolio that does best in whatever the worst case is for that particular investment that is actually picked. So with that those are kind of the four main approaches that we discuss in the paper. And really quick, just to kind of close this all up, because I believe this is my last slide. I think the most important thing that is kind of a takeaway from this paper is that moving towards this framework of scenario analysis is really the most important kind of least regrets thing that planners can be doing now. Because basically when we're just using deterministic optimization to provide all of the information that we need, we're missing the fact that the future is uncertain and things could go differently from how we expect. And I will also emphasize that moving towards this framework of scenario analysis actually doesn't require any new modeling tools, but it does require a mindset shift towards understanding that models can and should be used in this better way. So with that, I will close it up and pass it over to Priya for any last questions here.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Gabe. We do have one question, I think, actually two questions. First one is, how is the scenario analysis framework that you presented different from conducting sensitivity analysis of a particular IRP scenario or portfolio?
Yeah, so sensitivity analysis can mean a lot of different things, but oftentimes what it means is taking your deterministic optimization model, right, which in the context of IRP is going to be telling you an optimal set of generation and or transmission investments. And what you're doing in sensitivity analysis is you're just modifying a set of assumptions, right? You might take like a lower fuel cost or a higher fuel cost or a different demand, and it's telling you how those decisions would change, right? And so what sensitivity analysis is it's really just kind of a new scenario for deterministic optimization. And it tells you how your decisions now would change if the future were to change, right? What that doesn't tell you is how the decisions that you might make now would perform under those different ways that the future could evolve, right? So what I'm actually advocating here is a move from considering future uncertainties as something to be kind of like plugged into your deterministic optimization, and you do sensitivities around, to something where you take those kind of key uncertainties that affect the performance of your portfolio and examining them in the context of more of a scenario analysis approach. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's great. I love it. And really bringing it back to that whole sort of stress testing kind of framework. There's one more question, actually two more questions. Could you share the optimization formulation in the various scenarios? I think he means various methods. And maybe you could speak a little bit, Gabe, to the content that's in the report, which is on the IRP CoLab website.
Yeah. So I'm definitely happy to talk math offline, but I mean, so in the report, there is more details about kind of what I'm actually talking about here in terms of stochastic and robust optimization. At a high level, these are really mathematical concepts that have been around for a long time. People have been using these for over 20 years. And robust optimization in particular is actually really, really common in the finance world. In fact, it's so common that there are solvers built into Excel to solve this, right? So it's really commonly used in the finance world because people obviously recognize there also that the future is uncertain and people are wanting to make investments that are robust and adaptable, right? So yeah, they're very common formulations, but I think that the key thing that I'm trying to communicate here is that there's really a mindset shift that needs to happen in order for these to be valuable in the IRP world.
Great, fantastic. There's another question, but part of that I think is a great discussion question for the end. So I think we'll keep moving. Thanks again, Gabe. So last but not least, we have Harry van der Weide, who is the head of research and market development at Open Energy transition, and he will be presenting on automation and reproducibility in integrated resource planning. Please go ahead, Harry.
Thank you very much, Priya, and thanks to everybody who's attending this. So I have the honor of giving the last presentation here, and also perhaps the one on the most mundane or potentially boring topic. So I'm going to try and make it interesting. Also, full disclosure, I work for an organization that helps organizations adopt open source models. So obviously I have an interest in transparency and open source, but we really came to this topic with an open mind, looking at what's happening in different IRPs and how these can improve. So if we can have the next slide. So the motivation for this is related to the motivation of the other deep dives. So what we're seeing, of course, is that IRP processes are complex, and they're getting more complex, especially if we adopt some of the techniques that Gabe and Nicholas and Aaron were looking at. So this is not just a simple study. This is usually a combination of many different data gathering processes, models, often several models, stakeholder engagement, often engagement with a regulator, maybe coming back and doing some of the modeling again. So this is a complex process which is performed also, of course, under a lot of time pressure usually, and under pressure from a regulator. But what we're seeing is that even though this is a complex process, a significant part of this process consists of repeated model evaluation. So almost all IRPs have some substantive modeling component. And what we often see is that these models are run several times with different scenarios, with different assumptions. Maybe several models are run in series. Maybe we're doing, as we were just talking about 5 minutes ago, sensitivity analysis. And a final point in the motivation is that IRPs, of course, need to involve stakeholders, including always regulators, interveners, but maybe also other stakeholders, such as local communities or other stakeholders that can have an influence on the not just on the planning process, but also on whether these plans actually come to fruition. And in this context, where you have a very complex process with many moving parts, but also parts that you need to redo often, and a need to explain this process, but also to, in this process, engage with lots of external stakeholders. That seems to be a process where automation and reproducibility can really help. And these are two separate things, but we decided to take them together in this deep dive because they reinforce each other. So with automation, we mean having standardized workflows, having automated workflows, so scripted workflows that don't rely on human beings to press a button to go to the next stage. But for instance, automated data processing, so that every time a new data set comes in, it's automatically processed into the data that you need for your model. Automated model runs, so that you don't have to manually press a button, but again, every time something changes, you can run a whole analysis, you can run a whole workflow in one go. So this means that you can update scenarios faster, you can do reruns faster, and also there is less potential for human error to enter into this process and to have more confidence into your results. And in the end, also to make it easier when you're in front of the regulator to explain why everything has happened, because you will have fewer potential for human error to have come in. So that's automation. On the other side is reproducibility. Can you easily reproduce all or part of the analysis for an IRP? So that, of course, is helped by automation, because if you have an automated workflow, you can easily rerun it. But it's also helped by things like version control, documentation, accessible tools and data that are transparent, etc. But reproducibility, automation helps with reproducibility. Together, if you work on both, you can ensure that you can rerun parts of analysis or even a whole analysis for an IRP with the same parameters to produce identical results, to reproduce results. But it also allows you to rerun analysis or to facilitate analysis with different scenarios. And it enables you to share much more easily analysis across teams, across stakeholders, maybe even let stakeholders do some of their own analysis with the same tools that you're using, etc. For reproducibility, I think it's important to make a distinction here between internal and external reproducibility. Internal reproducibility means can you, within your utility or within your regulator, or whoever's doing a part of analysis, can you easily reproduce a part of analysis that has been done before? So can you do it internally within the company? That's obviously usually a first step. But there's also external reproducibility. Can someone else, an intervener or someone else who's interested, can they reproduce your analysis? That obviously comes with many more issues related to data security, privacy, which I'll go into in a little bit later on. But at least, so reproducibility can also just be internal. It can mean make your own life easier. If I can have the next slide, please. So the way we approach this problem is, first of all, to look at a number of case studies of IRPs or IRP-like processes, not just in the US, but also in other parts of the world, to see how automation and reproducibility are currently tackled there, and what good practices there are that are maybe transferable to other places, but also which challenges these IRP or IRP-like processes see that are common to all of them. So we looked at a number of them, which were selected either because they were interesting, because they used a lot of transparent tools already, or had a lot of automation built in already, or because they were IRPs that spanned multiple states, so the kind of engaging with multiple stakeholders was already baked in. So we looked, for instance, at the Upper Midwest IRP, where there is a degree of automation and reproducibility already in the process. But there, for instance, we heard from stakeholders that versioning, especially on model outputs, was less than it could be, and that made engagement, for instance, with the regulator harder, because even finding out which version of the file had to be sent and which version of the file had to be reviewed could take time. Within the US, we also looked at the Carolinas IRP from Duke Energy, which is very strong on documentation and on documenting the workflow. So good also on internal reproducibility, but less on external reproducibility because of the particular tool set that is used there, which is proprietary and not available to all stakeholders. New Mexico IRP is an interesting case study because they use open source tools and really emphasize stakeholder engagement, and maybe these two things have something to do with each other. We also looked outside the US. We looked at the new Quebec integrated resource plan, which is a process that, at least when we were doing the study, was still being set up, and which had a real aim, which has a real aim to be transparent, although it's somewhat unclear who is enforcing that transparency. We also looked at the New Zealand IRP-like process, which I will not try to pronounce. What's interesting there is that they use very different metrics or very different objectives also than are common in the US. So making sure that society is involved and that these plans don't just meet cost objectives, but also equity and equality objectives is really important there. And finally, we looked at the 10-year network development process in Europe. If you're not familiar with this, but you are interested in IRP-like processes, this is a very interesting one to look at, because NSOE is the organization of all European transmission system operators. So that's more than 40 system operators who get together every 2 years to together make a set of scenarios for what the future of the European energy system might look like, to identify investments that are optimal, and to publish these widely as well. So here's a process where a very, very large number of stakeholders have to get together to make something that looks quite like an integrated resource plan or a transmission plan, which is also an interesting learning point. The kind of common challenges that you find everywhere, not just in the US, but also in these other places, is that data preparation is still in many places quite a manual effort. There is usually in these processes, at some point, someone emails a CSV file to someone else. Maybe even someone copies and pastes one of the columns to another file. And this makes particularly reproducibility really hard. Also makes transparency hard, because if it's not clear what happened to the data, what the provenance is, it makes it hard to be transparent. And this is a problem that is almost everywhere. What we also see is model fragmentation. There are usually different models used in IRPs, different models used by adjacent utilities, sometimes that are subject to the same regulator. Some places regulators specify that utilities in their region all have to use the same model, but that's not true everywhere. And if, for instance, we look at a process like the LA 100, which is a very transparent process with all the data published, there are so many models involved there that it becomes just very hard to reproduce a process like this. And we talked to some of the people involved in that particular process, and they told us that basically for every link between models, they needed an expert in each of the models to properly transfer the data from one model to another. That means that you need a very large team to run this kind of analysis. That means it's very hard for someone else who hasn't been involved from the beginning to do this. Poor documentation speaks for itself. Some IRPs are very good at this. But generally, of course, when you're under pressure to deliver an IRP, there's always a temptation to say, we'll do the documentation later on, but then later on probably means there is another process which takes priority and documentation might be lacking. And of course, there are institutional barriers. There are ingrained practices within utilities, also definitely within regulators, that make it hard to automate or to be more transparent. If I can have the next slide. So we looked at these IRPs. We talked to many of the people that were involved in running them. We also looked at the information that was available publicly. And based on that information, so comparing between the different IRPs, we came up with a number of recommendations. And here on this slide, I just have the recommendations at a high level. For each of these recommendations, there is more detail in the paper, broken down exactly what are the steps you could take, who would be responsible for these steps. Sometimes it's the regulator, sometimes it's the data team within a utility, so chief data officer or whatever. Sometimes it might be an IRP team. And what is the benefit if you do this? So if you look at the paper, you will, for each of these recommendations, get a table with concrete steps that you can take to get started with this. But the first recommendation is also the quickest win. Version control is already very common for documents. It's much less common for model instances and also sometimes for data sets. That creates frictions when you're trying to share your model with a regulator or with an intervener. It makes it much harder to figure out what exactly happened, so you can go back and rerun part of the analysis. But version control is nothing new. All of the organizations that we talked about already apply it. For instance, to the IRP documentation. Applying it also to data and to models is a very quick win. And in the paper, you find some more detail about what steps you can take to broaden version control from documents to just other parts of the analysis. A second recommendation is sharing executable models where that's possible. So many IRPs data sets that have gone into the model as well as the model assumptions are shared. That's great. It still makes it very difficult for someone to reproduce your analysis because they would have to build a model up from scratch. And I don't know if this is a signal that I should go to my conclusions, or can we go back to the previous slide? Thank you very much. So again, LA 100, really nice process, really transparent. All the data is available in PDFs that are hundreds of pages long. All model assumptions are available in PDFs that are hundreds of pages long. Theoretically, you could use all of that to rerun the analysis. In practice, that's not feasible. So sharing executable models, which some utilities do, which some utilities are also forced to by their regulators, really helps. Of course, if you use proprietary models, that might still be difficult for people to use. So here it really helps to use open source tools. Standardized formats speaks for itself. Use consistent templates and also use consistent metadata and record the metadata, which is often missing in processes. Tool interoperability. I've already talked about the fact that these IRP processes usually use several tools in parallel or in series, and different IRPs in the same, broadly speaking, geographical area use very different tools. It's fine if everybody uses different tools. There are different requirements in different locations, so I'm not advocating for everyone to adopt a single tool, but it helps if they're interoperable. It helps if you can move data from one tool to another tool easily and ideally in an automated way. It helps if someone can take your analysis and run it through their tool. It helps if you can do, once you've done a high-level transmission expansion plan, you can port that data to a, say, a Powerflow model easily, so you can test how that plan performs. So tool interoperability really helps. And that is much facilitated if you use open formats, open models, and a modular design. So not one piece of software that does your entire analysis but does not communicate to anything else. Other recommendation, peer review. Of course, peer review happens within IRP processes very extensively, but peer review tends to be a review of the outputs of the reports that are produced. It is really helpful, and we're seeing that, for instance, in Europe, that peer review internally, first of all, but also when you can externally, of workflows and of documentation really helps, because it provides an incentive for the teams who are doing the modeling to make sure not just that they produce an output that people can read, but also that their documentation stands up to scrutiny and that their workflow is explainable. So I have no doubt that these workflows are good and that this documentation is sufficient, but knowing that someone else is going to look at it and going to give you feedback on it, even if that is just another team within your own utility, make sure that you're going to set this up right from the start. And then there's some longer term recommendations, of course, institutional capacity, train staff, align incentives for reproducibility. That's particularly one for regulators to take on board. And ensure consistency across IRPs. In Europe, we're in a situation now where most of the system operators use at least a similar toolbox, which makes it easy for neighboring system operators to exchange data. It makes it easy for the regulator to look at everything without having to have the capacity to use 20 different tools. In the US, for many reasons, we're not there yet. But it seems to make sense to adopt shared practices and also to see where tools can be shared. Because shared tools means less maintenance for everybody. It means easier communication, comparability. So in the end, everybody wins. Again, there's more detail on the paper on each of these points with more concrete steps to take and who should take them, which takes me to my conclusions. And I'll be very brief, Priya. So automation and reproducibility are technically achievable, and there are clear places where this is already happening. Within the US, but also outside the US, but it requires institutional commitment, of course, and it also requires incentives. So regulators definitely have a role here. Current practice, as we all know, is fragmented, but there are quick wins. For instance, version control beyond documents. Another point to note is that open source tools and datasets are ready to use for these kinds of studies. Shout out to some of the great initiatives in the US, like Poodle, Powered Genome, but also models like GenX, Pipes, and GridPath. So these models and these open source models and datasets are there. They're increasingly being used also by utilities, by regulators. And they can really help with automating your workflow because you have control over exactly how you run these models, but also with transparency because you can easily share models. Of course, there are key dilemmas that have to be solved, for instance, about confidentiality and model complexity. Confidentiality in the sense of which data do I share, which parts of my model do I want to share, which parts can I not share, and model complexity. Am I going to set up new, especially open source models with complex workflows that are automated? Automation is great, but maybe at some point my team doesn't actually understand what the workflow does anymore. So there are difficult decisions to be made here. But the advantage is that these decisions have to be made explicitly if you're really going for transparent for reproducibility and automation. Currently, you might just not share your data because you can't. That's also a decision, but that's an implicit decision. Focusing on reproducibility and automation will mean that you have to make that decision explicitly, but that in the end, I think is a better situation than being forced into one particular position. I'll leave it there, but happy to answer your questions.
Great, thanks. Thank you so much, Harry. so much good information there. I'm going to take two clarifying questions, and then we'll bring everybody back on video. One question is, what is your preferred version for sharing model code and data sets? Is it GitHub or something else?
I think it depends on your institutional requirements. GitHub is not an option for many institutions just because of the requirements that they have on security. But a private GitLab environment, for instance, can solve that. But there are also other solutions. There are some suggestions in the paper about what potential solutions are there. So I would say, look at your context, speak to a chief information officer, chief data officer about what the requirements are. Again, GitHub is great for open source stuff, but if you are making a copy of an open source package and you want to use it internally without sharing it externally, there are probably other options that you should be looking at, like an internal GitLab account, but everything depends on your requirements.
Right. There's another question which is related to taking some of these raw data sets, curated data sets such as Puddle, which you mentioned on the slide, and then translating them into model-ready inputs, and whether IRP CoLab has done work in that regard. I'll answer the IRP CoLab portion of the question, which is that IRP CoLab specifically hasn't done work here, but some of our respective organizations have, such as GridLab. And Harry, I'm wondering if you want to speak to that from the OET perspective.
Yeah, so there are implementations definitely of data sets like Poodle that pull in that data, convert it to energy model data, and run it. Some of those are specific to model frameworks. I know, for instance, Cameron Taranchi, who was on the call earlier, I don't know if he's still on the call, worked on that for to make sure that Poodle data is available in PipeSA. There's also some work on GenX. So for many of the well-used open source packages, there are workflows that you can readily take that will convert these data sets into energy model data without you having to kind of manually redo it every time.
Great. Fabulous. We actually, let's let Cassidy, if we can bring everybody back, stop screen sharing and bring everybody back to video, we can jump into the next portion. So thanks everybody for sticking with us this long. This is sort of the first portion, the meat of it, but now we get to get into, deeper, perhaps philosophical questions. I'm going to kick us off with one question that I'd love each of our three groups of presenters to tackle, which is that I think you've all spoken to some great, exciting techniques, new techniques in some cases, but for any of us who've worked with utilities and utility planning groups, resource planning groups, they're really overwhelmed. It's pretty much they're going nonstop from one IRP to the next. It takes a long time to get, if you're switching to a new modeling tool, to get that modeling tool calibrated and set up. So for each of your themes, what advice might you give to, let's say, the head of a utility IRP team on how they should be implementing these tools and suggestions? What's the starting point, an accessible starting point that you would recommend? And maybe we'll start off with Aaron and Nick. We'll just go in the same order.
Yeah, I can jump in, and then Nick would love you to share as well. I think on the last slide we had several sort of next steps and recommendations, and I think number one was very intentional. Number one being fostering a cross-disciplinary understanding. And I think this really starts by getting generation and transmission planners talking to each other, and particularly speaking the same language. I think getting together, sitting down, understanding respective timelines, respective challenges, the respective tools that the different planning teams are using, can be the start for laying a foundation for further sharing of data, tools, methodologies that can then seed into these specific modeling approaches. I think some utilities have actually begun making structural changes of having integrated planning teams that really put these planners under the same roof, under the same department. And I think that's a great model that suggests that by bringing people together, by breaking down these barriers, we can start to have the needed conversations and creating those data process and institutional frameworks that then the modeling can flow from.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the one thing that I would add, kind of more from a transmission planning perspective, that's the majority of my background, is when you are performing analysis, which is required based on standards, whatever else you have within your organization, is broadening your approach to those problems. So it's not just simply, let me go and finish this analysis and get the result and call it done. But let's take a step back before we start and make sure the analysis that we're doing not only makes sense to answer the question we're looking to answer, but how else can we use this time, which is valuable, analysis time to help inform decisions on the system as we go forward? One example I can share is I know in the NERC TPL requirements, there's a clause for including sensitivities. And so can we consider those sensitivities to help inform other decisions besides just meeting this requirement and checking the box? But can we use it to help, inform where we might need new resources, where we could do certain upgrades that would help unlock additional generation? So yeah, I think just kind of broadening the thought process when it comes to running analysis that we do have to do.
Great. Gabe, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in for mine. So I think, yeah, I would say kind of in line with what I was saying before, that I think the most important kind of like least regrets thing to do that also does not require any new types of models or anything like that is transitioning to this idea of considering scenarios and uncertainties in the context of scenario analysis instead of just deterministically via running different deterministic scenarios, right? And so I will say that like this is obviously would require often a change to IRP processes in the way that people are usually used to thinking about things, but it doesn't necessarily, I think it often will look more like restructuring and redesigning a process rather than just adding another thing to add on, right? So it like, I mean, the whole point of this is that it's different from the way that people are doing it right now, right? And that does mean that people are going to have to update their processes and kind of rethink the ways that the processes are done. But it doesn't have to end up in like more work. It's really just more of rethinking the way that the processes work.
Yeah, great. And I love that you emphasize that you don't need new tools to have this change in approach. Harry.
Yeah, I don't have a silver bullet. I think the automation can save a lot of time, but it requires an upfront investment. So that's also clear. This is going to take something to implement, and in the longer term, I believe it's going to save time. We recently, not for this project, but for another one, did some interviews with utilities and figured out, you could probably save a double-digit percentage of people's time if you do automation well. But it takes an initial investment. I do want to share one thing that one utility told me, and I won't tell you which one it is. They said, okay, we see many utilities are under a lot of stress, and they're trying to deal with this by getting more people, getting more money, and hiring more people. But if you're in a situation where you're scrambling to do your tasks and you bring new people into that atmosphere, they're actually going to make the problem worse, because you're hiring people into an organization that's in stress, and they will keep that flywheel going. So what you actually need to do, this one utility said their strategy is they actually stopped hiring for a while, figured out what their priorities were that they could do with the current team. And when they had those, then they went back to the regulator to get more money and get more people in, because they wanted to avoid bringing people into this highly stressed situation. I'm just putting this on the table. I think it's an interesting idea. But definitely, even automation is going to save you time in the long term. It does take some upfront investment, but there are quick wins which don't hopefully take too much.
Great. I'm going to combine two questions into a general question, which is around regulatory barriers and also potentially regulatory incentives that the 3 or 4 of you are seeing in your respective topics that either could be a barrier to implementing the tools and the approaches you're talking about, or scenarios where you're seeing the regulators taking action that is moving the industry practice towards some of these recommendations. And I'm happy for anyone to jump in who's ready to tackle that.
Yeah, I can jump in popcorn style. I mean, I think in the context of investor-owned utilities, I think, their whole goal is to get the utilities to be making investments that are going to be prudent and reasonable and not stranded, right? And so I think like thinking about uncertainty in a more holistic way in support of utilities doing that is exactly what they want to be doing. And so I think for that reason, this is something that we see being discussed in regulatory contexts all across the country, especially because people are seeing what happens often when there are not sufficient investments being made, right? In a time of demand growth, right? Then you just get skyrocketing prices, right? So I think this is very much aligned with what the goals of regulators are. And I think there's already a lot of pushes or there's already a big push going on right now to move towards this kind of a thinking. And that's also why I think in the more forward-thinking utilities and also RTOs, we see this kind of analysis happening, especially in terms of that, like the whole idea of like heuristic-based planning I was talking about, right? Like the more forward-thinking RTOs that are doing transmission planning are really thinking about, okay, what are the least regrets investments that we can make, right? So I think it's definitely already happening.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think one of the challenges that I see from a regulator's perspective is that one of the sort of nice things about both the transmission planning or the generation planning process in isolation is that they give you a number, right? In generation planning, it can give you a least cost portfolio, for example. And I think, Gabe's presentation does a great job of like some of the questions we should asking about is least cost or deterministic really the right answer. But I think where some of these interactions can appear when we start thinking about generation and transmission planning more holistically are benefits that aren't immediately clear within some of these existing planning frameworks. So being able to get network benefits from siting a generation in a certain location. And so I feel like regulators have this challenge of the answer for a lower cost solution isn't going to be there necessarily just from reading the filing or just from reading the plan. So I guess my thought here is an opportunity to empower regulators to help make these connections about how these closer integrations can lead to truly system-wide least cost portfolios in ways that just aren't being captured right now. Because I think it could be very easy for regulators and staff reviewing these plans to miss those connections, given that I think they're mostly not being made apparent or explicit right now.
Great.
I'll just add, I think regulators are hugely important, especially for pushing transparency and reproducibility. And I think that's also their jobs, because many of these investments are being done in the end with public money, and therefore it is right that a degree of transparency is necessary. We see in Europe that regulators are very heavily pushing that, and actually the utilities who were at first reluctant more and more start to like this because they realize that they can also much more easily share data with their neighbors. But that regulators definitely had a leading role. What I see in the US, of course, is that in many jurisdictions, regulators are quite specific about what software can or cannot be used. And I think that relates to all of our deep dives. That can also be a restriction that prevents utilities from doing something cool and better and new. So I think there's some work to be done also to educate regulators on and there should be requirements on software, but how does this make sense in a changing world?
Yeah. Harry, I think you also bring some really great experience from Europe, which you did touch on in your presentation. Just keeping in the same vein of what regulators or planners should be keeping in mind from other regions. Are there specific lessons or experiences that you think U.S. planners or regulators can learn from the European experience around open source modeling, around transparency in planning or collaborative planning processes?
I think it's especially collaborative planning processes. So the fact that you can get 40 system operators, also all have their national regulators, but you can all get them to work together to produce a set of scenarios, to produce long-term plans for transmission expansion. So that's actually, I think the European experience shows that's actually possible. It's not easy, and it probably takes about 10 years to set up at least. But it's possible, and it means that investors, have a set of scenarios that they can, for instance, use to evaluate their investments across Europe. They don't have to redo analysis for every single country. It means that there's a lot of synergies between countries, so not each country doesn't have to do its own, decide what its own reserves are going to be, for instance, without consulting or having to consult individually with all of the neighboring countries. There is a body which you can bring these kinds of questions. So I think I've always wondered why this thing exists in Europe and not in the US. Maybe Europe is kind of naturally a little bit more focused on collaboration, and the US is more focused on competition. I don't know, but I think we're seeing in Europe there are a lot of benefits to coordinating at least the large decisions on transmission, on reserves, on large-scale storage, and it also shows that can be coordinated. Of course, what we have in Europe, we also have a European regulator that has a much wider remit than FERC has in the US. So that might be something that helps.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Maybe sort of shifting gears a little bit. Let's talk about tools for a moment. I think both Gabe, you as well as Aaron and Nick, sort of gave a range of approaches that vary in terms of sophistication, and possibly also may require some new tools or new ways of exercising tools that are already in existence. How are you thinking about that in terms of increased runtime, or potentially the needing to move towards sort of more legacy kinds of tools towards open source tools? And Gabe, in your case, we're talking about stochastic optimization or robust planning methods. And then Aaron and Nick, in your case, going to that third of the three choices that you presented around the purely co-optimized transmission and generation planning approach. Yeah, give us a little bit of insights around what people should be expecting in terms of computational effort and runtime, or maybe even being open to using new tools, new modeling tools.
Yeah, I guess I can jump in. So I think certainly if you take a deterministic IRP planning capacity expansion model exactly as it is and make it stochastic, the runtime is going to increase by a lot. But I think the thing is that that's important to recognize, is that it's much better to have a simpler model that accurately represents uncertainty than a very complicated model that's overly precise and kind of over optimized to one specific feature, right? So, IRP teams bend over backwards to get all sorts of minute details in, but then what they often forget is that is going to only tell you what the optimal outcome is based on what you put into it. And it's not going to take into account what is going to happen if the future is different from what you expect, right? So I think oftentimes the investment in terms of technical detail that people put into capacity expansion models is misplaced. And it would be better to put that into thinking about a stochastic or robust model instead.
Great, thank you. Aaron or Nick?
Yeah, I think my first thought here is the options that we present in this webinar, and there's many more in the full report, is like a menu of options. And I think thinking through and prioritizing among those is going to be key here. We don't need to do everything at once. Rather, incrementally looking for what are the most pressing needs for my specific jurisdiction or my utility, and then implementing sort of one at a time, baby steps. Um, I think another thing to keep in mind with a lot of these approaches, both the incorporate approaches and iterate, is that these can be done within existing modeling tools and framework. And part of the key here is making sure we're getting the right data passed between them. So even in an iterative modeling example, that doesn't necessarily require higher resolution. Rather, it requires that we are passing the right information about each planning process to the other. So I think for some of these, it's really more a question about the data and the assumptions that the model is able to see than building higher resolution temporally or spatially into the model. Other approaches, such as moving to copper sheet to zonal or zonal to nodal, do require actually incorporating greater resolution. That's going to increase runtime. So I think there's important questions about what do we want to prioritize? How can we assess the different trade-offs that we might need to make as we try to adopt some of these practices? And then finally, regarding the fully co-optimized approach, I don't want to hazard a guess about how long a truly fully co-optimized approach is. I think that is beyond what current tools are capable of. I think the example we shared, though, of, for example, just allowing capacity expansion models to see transmission reinforcements as an option is just one example of how we can, again, back to baby steps, take these baby steps of ways of getting more granularity in terms of the cost associated with both transmission and generation planning to be viewed at the same time within the modeling framework. And so I think rather than thinking about sort of that final prize of the full co-optimization, it's what additional costs can we allow the model to see? And how can we incrementally expand the scope of those system-wide costs ultimately to get better system-wide outcomes?
Awesome. These are great comments. I think all four of you have given us a lot of food for thought around this theme of how can you get more with what you have, if you make smart sorts of planning and modeling decisions. And I think we can leave it at that. We're just about 6 minutes from the allocated 90 minutes. So thank you to all of you for presenting such great material, and also thank you to our participants and our audience for sticking this out. We will be posting the recording on the IRP CoLab website, and also just as a reminder, all of these emerging themes reports are available on the website at irpcolab.org. And feel free to reach out to us. There's a form on the website if you want more information, or if you have some ideas for us to pursue, or if you would like to collaborate with us. And we're really excited about where these topics, as well as some of the ideas that were presented in our first webinar, can take the overall industry practice as we all tackle these emerging challenges. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.